Ali, what about you? Any surprising things from your assessments or filters? Or I guess how do you filter your decisions?
What I like to do every time I had a significant change, I always have this same process done with my significant other. Um, and since she knows me so well, she also kind of ranks the things, and we get a chance to have, because one dimension is this identifying what these attributes, role items are. Another dimension is I give a certain score, and she gives a certain score. So that's kind of starts a separate discussion, because sometimes it's kind of hard to be extremely honest with yourself because something may be so exciting, some other attribute you kind of just underestimate another one. So that seems to keep me honest. And again, in this case, who you know matters a lot. The people who have done this job and or similar jobs, maybe sometimes in the same company, can actually help with decision making. You can get that information provided. I love the idea of doing certain things, coming up with certain decisions, and like sleeping on it, or like at least sleeping on it at night. Walking for a couple of days. Not like whole, like just thinking about it constantly. And another thing that I felt like this is the biggest, I think, a marker for me to see if this is the right decision or not for me, how energized I feel the moment that I start imagining myself being there. It just generally never fails me. And that's kind of like the litmus test. I think if as long as you keep maximizing the, I think, energy, excitement, and comparing two things, you can tell which one is giving you more energy. It's a very very cool approach. And you also mentioned the it does this change over time. In my like for me, it's absolutely. I feel like I know about myself a lot more now than I knew, say like 10 years ago, and I knew like 10 years before. I just like significantly changed. My priorities have changed. My how I look at life has changed. My values have evolved, and maybe it's not as like next week, but very frequently this needs to be kind of reevaluated, and it's just a part of the process. Like there's really no work around it. It's not like you can just say this is it, this is who I am. It's not it's the adaptable one that survives the longest. But another maybe the last thing I can say about this is that then if this does not feel right to you, it's possibly not right for you, right? It's just if it doesn't feel right, then possibly it's not. So I think just having some gut check will definitely at the end bring one to a closure.
That's great. Um, Ali, what you mentioned, you had some thoughts about how the decision making filter or your priorities changed over time. What are your thoughts there?
I couldn't agree more with Ali's assessment. You learn about yourself throughout the process. So totally changes. I think me, especially early in my career, I had a very loose idea of what I wanted to do. And I felt like I was just looking for the right job, but I didn't really know what that was. And so I felt like almost like the job kind of picked me, which I think is, best case scenario for recruiting. But I was looking for the right job and I ended up with that, the right one for the time, learned a lot. Would I want to do that job forever? No. And then I felt like the next phase for me was more about, making the next big tweak where I had to get my foot in the door in another direction. And for me personally, that was breaking out of like a very niche industry into a different industry, so a different section of healthcare tech. So for me, I was like, that's what I care about the most. It was a little bit less about the role at that moment. It was more about getting my foot in the door, so I could get access to the other opportunities that maybe I wanted. But as I've grown from there, I have higher and higher knowledge and standards of what I need in my role. So now I can be significantly more thoughtful. And it's not about like, oh, I'm going to take the first offer because that's giving me that opportunity. I can really be so much more thoughtful and selective with what I want, which I think comes with both learning about yourself and also experience in your role.
And just to add to that, because I think it's very important what you mentioned, and this is it must be a debated topic, but I generally encourage people, especially earlier in their career, to experiment a lot more, so they actually kind of evolve, kind of start to develop this understanding about yourself and about the industry and whatever it is, and you can actually, you know, go out of your wherever you've been trained, right, educated for. You can even get out of that just to explore, see if you will like it or not. Because the cost of doing that later in your career is a lot higher. Not impossible. Anyone can do anything anytime, but kind of a bit easier in the very beginning.
Yeah, I think in response to what both of you shared, like in kind of connecting the dots from a couple things that we've talked about. So we've talked about like making some assumptions about the role. We've talked about kind of filtering, and Ali, when you're talking about experimenting and using that as a frame of reference, there's been one framework that I found particularly helpful in terms of validating like your assumptions around a role, or giving some direction to the types of experiments that you take on for a role. And so it's kind of a mashup between two frameworks. So I've got a lot of internal ego and pride at around this concept, but it's a mixture between like Jim Collins's hedgehog concept and then Malcolm Gladwell's outliers. So the hedgehog concept, for folks unfamiliar with that, is like the intersection of three things. What are you passionate about? What could you be the best in the world at? And then what drives your economic engine? And the idea is that like this sort of sweet spot where you both feel purposeful and you're also like economically successful is at the intersection of like your love and your ability, and then like something that is like economically valuable. And then the other side, like Malcolm Gladwell's outliers, like the kind of TLDR of this is like there are certain things that allowed people to have outlier performance, and sometimes it's related to timing, and sometimes it's related to unique experiences earlier than others. So like one of the examples was Bill Gates getting access to a coding lab at Berkeley when he was like 16 years old or something like that, which then gave him the early experience to then build all of these other amazing things far earlier before anybody else was interested in that particular stuff. So with the hedgehog concept, when you're thinking about what are you passionate about, that's an easy list. You can talk about all the things that you love. Like I love surfing, or I love knitting or hiking, or whatever. And then in addition to like the things you love about your job. And then when you think about like, what could you be the best in the world at? The truth is like, especially if you are younger in your career, you are probably not the best in the world at a whole lot, if not anything. So when I was answering this, like there's nothing I'm the best in the world at. But how I wanted to reframe this question, which I thought was really important, was what could you be the best in the world at if you chose to invest in growing and training and developing your skill set in that area? And then pairing that with outliers, like what's something maybe that you've had more experience with than other people that's interesting or unique, that if you continue to invest in that, it'll help you become the best in the world at, or reasonably like top 5 or 1% or whatever. And then you answer all the other questions of like, what are the different like permutations of what people would pay you for? Like what's a valuable skill set that you can cultivate? So the intersection of that, then like you start to experiment being like, okay, I love this. This is economically valuable. And if I invest in this, I'm pretty good at it. And you can start to check off those experiments. So that's my mashup concept. It served me directionally. It's helped me cross off a lot of things on my list, but also open up opportunities in different things.